Welcome to Clarity, a podcast powered by the Thomson Reuters Institute. I'm Zach Warren, the Institute's Technology and Innovation Insights lead. In each episode, we dive deep into a single question from decision makers and thought leaders, from legal, corporate, tax accounting and audit, and government communities. In today's episode, we discuss the big question: how might changes in the current tariff landscape impact business? Tariffs are obviously not a new economic concept, but in recent days, the idea of tariffs has been brought to the fore. The Trump administration moved to utilize tariffs quickly, impacting trade between the US and Canada, Mexico, China, and really the entire world very quickly. As a result, financial analysts, tax professionals, and others have had to adjust and adapt quickly, preparing for a tariff-laden future that may seem unknowable. But even the complex and ever-shifting tariff landscape can be helped by a little planning. That's why we've brought in a knowledgeable panel of experts to help business leaders navigate this new paradigm. Today's host is Bryce, Engelland, Senior Data Analyst at the Thomson Reuters Institute.
Welcome to the first in a series of what will no doubt be special episodes on global trade and tariffs. Here, we're going to dive into the intricate world of international commerce and its dynamic challenges that it's currently facing. My name is Bryce, Engelland. I'm a senior analyst at the Thomson Reuters Institute, where I cover the global economy, supply chains, and the legal industry. I hold a master's degree in economics with a graduate thesis on the tactics and costs of multilateral trade wars. As such, I am truly delighted to bring a couple incredible experts for a discussion today where we'll try to answer the question of how changes in the current tariff landscape may impact businesses in the United States and potentially beyond. Today, we are first joined by Karen A. Lobdell. Karen is a senior manager at Thomson Reuters OneSource Global Trade with over 30 years in international logistics and trade compliance. She is a U.S. licensed customs broker and has served on the COAC and the AAEI boards. Karen is active in trade policy, forced labor, artificial intelligence, and tariffs. Karen and I are joined today by Robert J. Leo, a partner at Meeks, Sheppard, Leo, and Pillsbury LLP in New York, a law firm specializing in U.S. and international trade laws. With over 20 years of experience, he's served as vice president and counsel for the AAEI and actively participates in trade and legal associations. Bob is a cleared advisor to the U.S. government and was reappointed to ITAC 13 in 2022. Bob and Karen, thank you so much for joining us today. In this episode, we're going to explore the pivotal role of tariffs in global trade. Tariffs, which are essentially taxes on imported goods, serve as both a basic revenue generator and a tool for trade remedies. Recently, they've been leveraged heavily by the Trump administration as a primary instrument of foreign trade policy. Karen and Bob will help us understand how the rapidly changing tariff landscape is becoming a significant challenge for companies, affecting trade relationships and business operations. Let's start with a trip down memory lane. How was it that businesses used to manage tariffs even, say, 5 years ago when things were much more predictable? For example, how would companies plan around just a 10% tariff on an imported widget?
Thanks, Bryce. Great question. I think if we go back and look at, for example, 5 years ago or a little longer than that, I think the key word that you mentioned in your question was predictable. And I think that's really what we could say it used to be like. To a point, it was more predictable with regards to how tariffs were approached. We would tend to see, in most cases, any sort of increase surrounding the tariff area follow specific statutes and patterns that were something that companies were used to, whether that was countervailing duties, anti-dumping, Section 301, 232 type investigations. These all had a specific pattern that they followed with regards to the investigations, the finalized reports and outcomes, the timelines. And they were lengthy enough for companies to have the ability to build out a strategy and look at how they were going to approach those potential changes in tariffs and have the time to actually implement some of those strategies. And there were a lot of different avenues they could take, whether it was tariff mitigation, tariff avoidance, or tariff recovery. There were a number of different tools that were available to them. So those existing statutes gave them a more predictable approach. They also had the ability to provide notice of comments, and that could be input from subject matter experts as well as the private sector advisory groups that could provide feedback that could actually help in kind of further fine tuning that particular regulation or tariff so that perhaps it was more acceptable for the trade and for companies. That type of approach is very different than what we're seeing under the current tariff environment with the use of authorizations such as IEPA under national security, which don't have those lengthy windows for companies to really prepare. And I think that's where we see perhaps the biggest difference. And Bob, would you like to
Yeah,
add to
yeah,
that?
thanks. All good points, Karen. And also with that, the time given under this, with Section 232 and Section 301 tariffs back then, it allowed the countries of production, the trading partners, to negotiate a little bit as well. And with Section 232, try to get an exclusion, or to for Section 301 against China, it was help trying to get some products off the list. And for example, toys came off the list for Section 301 back then and were not put on at all. So it allowed that. It gave companies time to negotiate with their customers and with their retailers, and also their suppliers, to try to get a cost breaks on one end or the other. It allowed them some time to get product into the country, allowed them some time to either stack their inventory or move it out faster, offer sales to get it out, for make room for more. That time is no longer in existence with what's happening right now.
It definitely seems like the old era of kind of free trade agreements and the ability to make long-term plans, and for these things to slowly evolve has at least come to a bit of a temporary pause. What has sort of been lost in that case when it comes to the ability of companies to shift their sourcing and optimize their costs with strategy in these times? Like, what were some of the favorite strategies that now no longer seem easily employable?
Well, I'll start, and Bob, I'm sure you've got some additional ones to chime in, but I think there were, and we're definitely seeing that the options and the strategies are far more limited now. But when you looked at past approaches, you had tools such as, tariff mitigation strategies that would be along the lines of duty deferral programs, for example, the use of a foreign trade zone that could minimize the initial impact or at least defer the additional cost until a later period, giving a little bit of room. Possibility of use of first sale in some cases. To look at value adjustments. There was tariff avoidance approaches, such as you mentioned, like change in sourcing patterns or classification or origin engineering or use of a free trade agreement. And then, there was also the possibility of looking at recovery afterwards through reconciliation processes. And I'm just throwing out a few. I'm sure Bob's got some more. But these particular areas have become much more difficult to use as tools, not only because of the nature of how tariffs are being implemented under the Trump administration, but also the fact that those tariffs are triggering retaliatory tariffs. So some of those options simply disappear because the tariffs are everywhere. They're not focused on just one country. They may be focused on goods coming from any country, in the case of, for example, steel and aluminum. So shifting procurement may not have any impact whatsoever. And that's just one example. I'm sure, Bob, you probably have some
Yeah,
additional.
yeah. I mean, one of the big things back then was to use free trade agreements, or think about going to another country with a free trade agreement. Not a lot, but production shifted to Morocco for certain products that has a free trade agreement with the United States. The use of AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, for fabric from third countries into African countries, and made into garments or other material that came into the United States. That was eligible back. That was okay back then. You mentioned the foreign trade zones, bonded warehouses, drawback, where you brought something in and then maybe manufactured into something else and sent it out, you could get your duty back on what you brought in. Now those are being eliminated with the orders that are coming out a little bit late for any planning. The tariffs are announced, and then a couple of days later, you get the actual specifics. But those options are taken off the table. There's no drawback allowed. There's no you can put it into a foreign trade zone, but if you bring it back, you bring something into the United States from a foreign trade zone, you're still going to pay the duty on the part or materials that you put into the foreign trade zone from a country that's taxed or tariffed. And to Karen's point, the last point there is really the most important: is that business doesn't have anywhere to turn. Aluminum and steel is a perfect example. The reciprocal tariffs coming up on April 2nd, already here by the time you hear this podcast, will cover a lot of different countries. And then you have the retaliation too. Are your exports going to be damaged? And with the first round of Trump tariffs in the first administration, we had a client that was ready to hire more people around in the New York area and was exporting to Canada, and the China tariffs shut it down completely because he ended up having to pay 25% tariffs. He didn't lose his business, but he laid off people. He stopped exporting, and he wasn't producing. He was bringing in materials to produce something in the United States, and he stopped the production because it was cheaper to have. Then it had the reverse effect. Everything if you're going to make a finished product that's still subject to the tariffs, why incur U.S. labor costs when you can make the whole product overseas and pay the tariffs and then just ship it to wherever? So those tools have been taken away.
It definitely seems like there has been a stark change in the global trade atmosphere, and one word keeps coming up over and over and over, and that's uncertainty. I'd like to start our next section kind of going over what the situation today looks like by mentioning that the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index, which is a metric that tracks the change in public uncertainty in regard to economic policy, well, that index has breached 2008 levels by a significant margin and is quickly gaining on pandemic levels, which are the highest the index has ever reached since at least the mid-'80s and likely since the Great Depression. In other words, we are quantifiably seeing extreme uncertainty with where things are headed. So let's start with Karen. Can you talk about the challenges businesses face due to the uncertainty in global trade regulations, and how do frequent changes and unclear guidance impact business operations?
Well, very good point. And the uncertainty is definitely the key word of the moment. I think it's going to continue for a while. This pattern of not knowing how things are going to change or when they're going to change and getting very short notice clearly is causing massive issues for companies that are dealing with the tariffs, whether they're a U.S. importer or a business partner or service provider that's in the mix. What we're seeing happen is this pattern that we're seeing is someone tweets, typically the president, on social media that this thing is going to happen, a tariff on a particular country. It's usually followed by some form of announcement on the White House website with an executive order or proclamation, which will then turn into a Federal Register notice. And then in the case of imports with U.S. Customs, further messaging from Customs in a CSMS message on additional instructions, as well as Federal Register notices. These things happen very quickly, but in many cases, not quickly enough. So companies hear this information, they start to try and plan, and in some cases, this is happening in the course of 24 to 48 hours. These things are coming into implementation and enforcement. It's not just gathering the necessary data that's going to be required to properly comply with these tariff changes and file your entries correctly. It's not just collecting the data, which is, ultimately an issue in and of itself, trying to gather the quantities, the value, the details needed from suppliers overseas in order to file. And I'm thinking steel and aluminum, just for example, but the programming that's going to be needed for technology systems to file with customs, for customs to actually receive and process those entries. Technology solution providers, when they make code changes to adjust for these things, go through, even in an agile, very quick process, are going through development and at least a couple rounds of testing to ensure that the systems are actually going to work. And US Customs must do the same thing. But when you have 24 or 48 hours to do it, you are really scrambling to see if it can even be done in time to make the deadlines. And we're seeing some major challenges with that, as well as our clients and companies having to make changes on their own systems internally to comply and capture that data and transmit it to the appropriate folks. It really is a challenge. We did see with the in the steel and aluminum case, we saw the changes in the technology systems with customs get pushed to their certification and testing environment the same day they were pushing to production at the same time, because they didn't have time to do the normal testing. And as a result, there were things that broke within the first 24 hours and have been corrected. But you end up with these issues as a result. And this is the constant motion that we're seeing, especially with the filing and the technology side of things. And Bob, please add to this, because certainly I'm speaking very heavily from the tech side in that example.
Yeah, no, those are good points, because and another example was the February 1st, they took away, when they put the first 10% on China, they took away the de minimis exemption for goods from China. They took it away, which is what they had said they were going to do. 3 days later, they gave it back because customs couldn't handle, and the brokers handling these de minimis shipments under $800 couldn't handle the volume and couldn't process it because the systems hadn't been changed to take that into account. And as of this recording, they still haven't fixed that or come up with a solution to that. So it's a big drain on the government, and the government layoffs going on at the same time. And then you have these other issues where, how does a company prepare for this when customs isn't prepared, and you don't get a notice? You get a notice overnight, and that's it. We had a client that was emailing me back and forth about the 10% tariff in middle of February, and saying he was getting some traction, getting his costs reduced a little bit. And then we were the next morning, I sent out the notice about the additional 10%, and his response was just, "I give up." And I haven't heard from him since. Hopefully he didn't check into a sanitarium somewhere. But this is what everybody's facing. And the other point I'd like to make about this is that there are goods on the water when these tweets come out, when the proclamation is finally written and published, and then a day or two later, if a Federal Register notice comes out, there are goods on the water, in the air, that have been ordered, paid for, cost has been determined, and they get hit and have been hit with these additional tariffs through no fault of their own. And who absorbs this? Even if the importer, if the retailer's not going to pay more when they've already agreed on a price to the importer is already paid or owes their supplier, but maybe the supplier can cut it, maybe not, and the importer gets stuck with the additional costs that they didn't plan for. And that's one of the big differences with this process versus previous, where you had time to get goods in before something happened.
It definitely seems like most people don't understand there is a really fine-tuned, well-oiled machine behind global trade, involving sophisticated software and hardware that makes the massive volume of global trade we're currently experiencing run relatively smoothly and efficiently. And that kind of machine can't quickly adapt to the changing circumstances in the best of times, let alone times where there's so much uncertainty to what even needs to be changed. Kind of throwing things back in Bob's direction, how does the lack of clarity in determine the value and country of origin for tariffs, particularly those imposed on China, create even more challenges for business in the current environment?
That's such a good point to discuss, because really what it comes down to, the key is trust. Can when tariffs like this happen, and especially with China, can the U.S. business trust the value and the country of origin that they're getting on their products? So, say when the first tariffs were put into place in 2018 or 2019, I can't remember that anymore. They were all of a sudden U.S. importers were getting solicitations saying, "Hey, why don't you? We can ship through Vietnam." Solicitations from Chinese companies. We can ship through Vietnam. We'll just package it in Vietnam and get it through you. You don't have to pay the China tariff. Well, that's illegal, and luckily my clients did not go along with that, but they told me about it and said, "Is this legal?" I said, "No." But they had to be able to trust that if they were going to shift sourcing, that the new country of origin was the correct country of origin and was legal under U.S. customs laws. But also the value did the value go down all of a sudden? It was $10 an item, now it's $8 an item. Can they trust that? They're happy with that. An import is going to be happy with that, but then U.S. Customs is not going to trust that, because they do monitor through those systems we were just talking about. They do monitor the price, the origin, the value, and any change in that is going to be noted. And maybe it's not a big change. Maybe $1 off $10 is not a big deal. $2 on a $10 item, you're talking, that's something that might click up in customs automated system, like a little red flag system. Can customs trust this? And the answer has been since 2018 that U.S. Customs does not trust products subject to these additional tariffs when there's a change in origin or a noticeable change in value. Because if they just say hold it, importer, you have to prove now that what you're giving to us, the information you're giving to us, is accurate and complies with U.S. Customs regulations and U.S. law. And that, to me, is the biggest issue out of the value and country of origin uncertainty.
Yeah, it definitely seems like the more you kind of dive into this scenario, even murkier things start to kind of lift to the surface, and you realize that there's yet another challenge to kind of be overcome. And as we start looking towards what the future may hold and what practical applications and practical solutions might be available to companies, I'd like to make another note. The last time I checked on how long it would take to get a factory building up and running in the United States right now, that wait period could be 4 years or more for a rail line or an advanced supply chain like those used for semiconductors. In a world where the trade situation is changing multiple times in a month, in a week, sometimes literally down to the hour or the minute, this makes significant expansion of manufacturing and trade basically impossible to plan around. So what options are clients looking around to? What are some of the practical solutions they're seeking and the ways forward they're trying to find?
Well, I think, Bryce, there's still a number of avenues that clients are attempting to pursue, or they're looking for where they can at least mitigate. And, this is something that I think will probably the answer will change over time as tariffs evolve and we see more, more on the horizon. Some of these things may have limited use, but we have seen, certainly with our client base, that there is definitely still a focus on looking at where feasible and where it makes sense, taking advantage of duty deferral type programs such as foreign trade zones, or as Bob mentioned, bonded warehouses. We've continued to see clients doing scenario what if plannings to look at options for changing and sourcing. Now, that with reciprocal tariffs, that could all go out the window, but they are still looking at that. They're looking at origin engineering, where it's possible to consider, and classification engineering, possible uses of free trade agreements to maybe limit the exposure or impact of those additional tariffs, although it's not going to eliminate them. I mean, we've definitely seen companies front loading, which comes with its own costs, but building that inventory to try to position themselves with regards to a strategy to take as little of an impact as possible. And they've been going back and negotiating with their suppliers to see if they can share the cost or have the supplier absorb the cost. I will say there was a really good example of how that may or may not be helpful or feasible that came out in the news this week, where Walmart had gone back and attempted to negotiate suppliers in China absorbing the cost of the tariffs. And that has been escalated up to the government level in China, and basically them saying this is not acceptable. It's deemed an inappropriate business approach. So we're seeing some definite pushback in that area. So it really is a guessing game in some cases, or a shell game to find
Yeah,
what works.
and I'd like to add to that because a lot of the options that Karen just mentioned have been taken off the table with the recent announcements. You can't use drawback on these additional tariffs. You can use a foreign trade zone or maybe a bonded warehouse to bring goods in to the United States without paying the duty. As provided you export them completely out of the United States, you won't be subject to the duty. But if you then do something to them or not do anything to them and enter them into the commerce of the United States, you're going to be hit with the duty again. So it doesn't really work as an option that way. The other thing about negotiation that you mentioned, Karen, with the suppliers, it's interesting because if China had agreed to that, and I agree with you that they're not going to, but say they said, okay, yeah, we'll come up with some way to lower the price or give you a subsidy for exports. Well, that's the definition of a countervailable duty under U.S. law and regulations, and there'd be more trade remedy cases for dumping at less than fair value in the United States or the subsidizing of exports from China and these other countries with the reciprocal tariffs. And the retaliation and then more reciprocal tariffs on top of the retaliation is going to take away options to source in other countries too.
It really appears that right now what we're seeing is a ton of uncertainty, and uncertainty really breeds risk. And traditionally, the way companies, both importers, exporters, and beyond, have dealt with risk is through insurance and other such measures and metrics. We had a wonderful kind of discussion a few days ago about this, and I was wondering if we could take a quick look at an example in the force majeure clauses. What are they? How are they being impacted? And why is this actually a surprisingly big deal when it comes to this discussion? And one reason it perfectly kind of showcases the difficulties companies face in this moment.
If I can weigh in on this first, Karen, the force majeure is also known as the act of God clause. Basically, it's when something happens that neither party expected, that affects the contract, that affects the price or the delivery or whatever. These uncertain tariffs that come out overnight are definitely unexpected. They can't be planned for. Can you use a force majeure clause for that? Well, the parties it's a contract between the parties, so they have to agree that they're going to put tariff changes in some form or another in the force majeure clause. So far, I haven't seen that. I haven't seen, of course, the importers would love that. And they would love it with the retailers would love it too, that they're not going to pay for any increase in tariffs. But I haven't seen that get in there. And a country like China that's not negotiating with the United States to get these tariffs down they're probably tell their companies, do not agree to this because you'll be holding the bag on the tariffs then. So you have these legal issues in a force majeure that it'd be great if companies can get that into their contracts. But right now, I think that's very unlikely. You can put in an indemnity clause, but the other party has to agree to that too. Indemnity meaning, hey, if to the supplier, if your country gets hit with tariffs, then you have to indemnify me for my additional costs. I think that's very unlikely. To Karen's point about China, if the government says don't do this, then the companies aren't going to do it. Other countries, maybe it's where they're more free trade or free enterprise, then maybe a company can agree to that. Although most companies don't want to do that. And then do you get into the lawyer's paradise of arbitration, or we'll go to court if the indemnification agreement is agreed to, but they don't agree once the tariffs are put into place that's what they meant. So it may be more work for lawyers, which is not a bad thing necessarily if you're a lawyer. But at the same time, it's more headaches and uncertainty for business.
That actually, Bob, brings up kind of the perfect final question for us today, which is that we've talked a lot about how these uncertainties and these changes in the global trade fabric are impacting manufacturers and those involved in import export. What about those who are involved in the tax and legal fields? How is this going to be impacting those really important sectors of the economy that normally you don't think are going to be impacted by something like a
Yeah,
tariff?
well, and one thing that I thought of immediately when Karen was talking before about valuation well, I think you mentioned transfer pricing, Karen, but transfer pricing for customs purposes, where you try to change the value or use a value at arm's length value between related parties or between um, different entities in the transaction. If you use for sale, for example, um, transfer price for customs is a different animal than transfer price for tax purposes. And I'm not a tax lawyer. I don't want to be a tax lawyer, but I know I'm dangerous enough to know, or I know enough to be dangerous. Let me reverse that if you have an issue for customs purposes on transfer pricing, it will affect on the tax side also. Um, and then you get into your normal contracts between companies. Is have you is somehow are these tariffs or failure to deliver on time? That's actually another big one. Failure to deliver on time, a breach of contract that the companies will then have to fight about. So it does get into these other areas.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bob. With that, folks, we are reaching the end, but I wanted to give both of our incredible speakers here today one more chance to kind of leave us with any parting words or final thoughts that they think are really important to the discussion. So, Karen, if you wouldn't mind, do you have anything else you would like to add?
I would just simply like to add that it's absolutely critical right now for anyone in the global trade arena to really stay on top of the daily flow of information coming from government sources, coming from your legitimate news sources, coming from your trading partners and business partners globally, to stay on top of what's going on. And as much as I'm sure some people would don't want to hear it, there's some value also to having to follow social media, because unfortunately our current administration is very fond of putting their plan of action there first. So, from a proactive standpoint, really staying on top of this type of news alert and paying attention more frequently than maybe you're used to in the past is critical to see what's coming. And also to work with your service providers that are sharing this information as they monitor it as well, whether it's coming through your customs and trade attorneys, your consultants, your global trade management software providers, brokers, and so forth. These folks all have a wealth of information that they're tracking. Make use of those parties and your trade associations to stay on top of this, and also benchmark with others in the industry in case they've got some suggestions you haven't thought of to try and tackle this. But we're all gonna have to stay on our toes, because this is certainly something that's going to continue to be part of our day-to-day business in the short term and very
Yeah,
possibly the long
I
term.
can't agree more to that. One thing I would add is right now you have to take a breath because you, we get all this information, and as we said before, it changes by the afternoon, or it has changed by the afternoon, or it will change, or maybe it won't change. But you can't react. You want to take everything in. You want to talk to the people you trust, but you can't. A business can't react with everything that comes out right away because you don't know what's going to happen. That what the next step will be. Will the 200% tariffs go on because of retaliation? Well, today, yes. Tomorrow, probably not. So you're going to you can drive yourself crazy with this, as I think we've proven today. Um, so it's keep informed, keep in touch with everybody, and try to keep sane as much as possible.
Perfect. Once again, I'd like to thank both Karen and Bob for coming and sharing all these valuable insights with us. It has been a pleasure having you here today, and we hope to have you on again, especially as this discussion only becomes more relevant and as more developments inevitably come.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for tuning in to today's special episode of the Clarity Podcast. We appreciate your interest and engagement as we navigate the complex and ever-changing landscape of international trade. We hope this discussion has provided you with a deeper understanding of the current trade dynamics and the challenges businesses currently and are moving to face. Once again, a special thanks to Karen Lobdell and Bob Leo for sharing their insights and expertise with us. Be sure to join us for our next upcoming episode, where we'll dive into the technology tools and approaches for mitigating and avoiding the impact of tariffs. We'll explore innovative solutions and strategies that businesses are using to navigate these challenging economic times. It's an episode you won't want to miss, so make sure to stay tuned in and stay ahead of the curve with us. Until next time, take care and keep striving for a better understanding of the world's economic interactions.
Thank you, Bryce, and our wonderful panel of experts. As our guest noted, a lot has changed even in the past 5 weeks, let alone the past 5 years of tariffs. But as business leaders do their best to prepare for an ever-shifting tax world, hopefully these examples and insights can provide a way forward in these changing times. Thank you as always for joining us for Clarity, powered by the Thomson Reuters Institute. You can follow or subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and don't forget to share with your colleagues and leave a 5-star review. For more data-driven analysis of today's professional services market and in-depth conversations with industry thought leaders, please visit us online at thomsonreuters.com/institute. Follow us on LinkedIn under the Thomson Reuters Institute. Clarity is a production of Thomson Reuters, copyright Thomson Reuters 2025.